Okay, we're off. Right, today this is the first lesson of Module 2, and Module 2 is all about the browser. So you've learnt how to write JavaScript. You're writing JavaScript in the Node environment, but JavaScript still primarily is a browser-based language. It was originally designed to make web pages a little bit more interactive. These days it's certainly evolved to a lot more than that, but its main purpose is really to make web pages more engaging and add additional functionality, and that's what we're going to start doing in Module 2. So today it's DOM manipulation. Now the DOM is the Document Object Model. That's what DOM stands for. It is basically a sort of object model. So that's not a phrase that you use very often, but an object model. So it is a sort of representation. Here we go, interactive representation of HTML document. So an HTML document is just a string, just a big old file of text. That's our document. A model is sort of how something's represented, and it is represented using objects. Each node in our HTML document is created, an object is created for each node, and that is why it's called a document object model, but you very often will just call it the DOM. In DevTools, so we'll take a look at this later. I think you will have used DevTools in Vasil's CSS and HTML lessons. DevTools are one of the best tools available to you. They're really excellent, and there's a lot of hidden features that are very, very good. The Elements panel displays the DOM to you, so we'll take a look at that later. And adding, removing, and updating elements is key to building interactive websites, and that's pretty much it. So you create new elements to appear on your page, you remove those elements, or you find an element that is on your page and you update that somehow. And that's it. So you may have heard about all these fancy JavaScript frameworks like React or Vue. That's all they do. There's a lot more to it, but ultimately they are just adding, removing, and updating elements on the DOM. So to find elements in our page, so we have an HTML page, we have some JavaScript that's going to run in our browser. We want to find some elements in that HTML page. We can use get element with some, actually, you know what, I'm gonna just add this get element asterisk or wildcard. So get element is the start of lots of different functions. We'll talk about that in a bit. So get element is sort of older. It's less flexible. It is probably more performant. That is a pro for using get element, the get element functions. But generally these days people tend to use query selector. It is slightly newer. It's not exactly brand new, but it's just much more flexible. With query selector, you remember one function, and depending on how you call it, what you pass to it, you can use all sorts of you can find all sorts of elements in the page. We'll look at both of these, but generally you're probably going to be using query selector. So these functions come from the DOM. So document is a sort of representation of the DOM, and the browser gives us access to the DOM through a global variable, a global object that is called document. So just like in Node, you have the sort of global function require, or you have global functions like parseInt and math.random and all of these things I think you've used. They're all global objects provided by the Node environment, whereas document has all the browser has all of those as well, but also it has the document because the browser is displaying a DOM, is displaying a document based on an HTML file that it's been given. So document.getElement, and again we're going to add a wildcard, document.getElement, etc., document.querySelector, document.createElement. We have our global object, the document, and on this document we want to find an element within the document somewhere. Or create an element with this function down here. So that's where these functions come from. There are global objects provided by the browser, and these are existing on the document. So getElement, here I've included the wildcard. GetElement by ID. That returns, I should have done a little quiz really, that would have been more interesting. But getElement by ID, that returns only one element, because now it's not, it is possible to have an ID, the same ID for multiple elements, but you shouldn't. All IDs should be unique. Not all elements need IDs, but if you are giving an ID to an element, it should be unique. So with that rule, assuming that you're following that rule, you can use getElement by ID, pass it the ID of the element you want to find in your page, and it will return to you a reference to that element in the page. This one, getElements by tag name. So we can see we have an S here, it's plural. GetElements by tag name. Tag name is referring to the name the name of the tag, funnily enough, but it's the opening and closing tags. We have an opening tag that says div or button, and a closing tag that says div or button. That's the tag name. So if we want to find all of the buttons in the page, every single one, we can use document.getElements by tag name and pass it button. It will give us an array, or something like an array of all of the button elements in the page. The same thing with class name, where IDs are used to identify particular elements. Classes are applied to multiple elements, or can be applied to multiple elements. So today I'm actually tired. I didn't sleep very well at all last night, so apologies. GetElements by class name, yeah, that gives us an array or something like an array, just like GetElements by tag name. But this time, if we are applying the same class to lots of different types of element, then we can use GetElements by class name to get all of those elements. So here are some examples. User form equals document.getElement by ID, and we pass it the string. The string that is defined as the ID attribute on the element in the HTML. User form is going to be equal to just one element. All the buttons in the page we call document.getElements by tag name, and we pass it the string button. That is referring to the tag name. And here we see actually it's an HTML collection of all the buttons. So I've just said it was an array or something like an array. Here it's something that's it's a bit weird. Really, it is an array of HTML elements, but for some reason the browser uses this sort of special class of object called HTML element that contains a bunch HTML collection that contains a bunch of HTML elements. Here we can get an HTML collection of big things by saying get elements by class name big. So all of the elements in the page that have the class big. They might have other classes, but we just want the elements with the class name big. And again, we get an HTML collection of all the elements with the class big. Okay, now I just nicked this page because it's got loads of content, it's got loads of other stuff on it. There's a bunch of images and all sorts. But I did it as I was telling you about leaving stuff till the last minute, and I've just left this till the last minute. So we'll see how it looks when I've just nicked it. I'm pretty sure it'll be okay. Cool, there we go. So that looks fine to me. Now somewhere down here, script, body, I'm going to add a script with source index.js and a closing script tag, and we're going to create index.js console.log hello from index. Let's make sure that works. Okay, excellent. That I don't really want all of those errors, so we can just hide them for both. Yeah, okay, great. Okay, there's still some images in here. Good. Okay, so I wanted a page with lots of content, so we can kind of do stuff with the content on the page. Okay, so we want to find this drop down. So here's the elements panel. On a Mac, you use Option Command I to open the DevTools. Actually, that opens console directly. Option Command I. Option Command J, I think, just opens the DevTools. Okay, no, I don't know. I or J or and you can go here as well. More tools and developer tools. Option Command I. Okay, so I was right. On Windows, it's something else that I can't remember. Something similar. Control Shift I, something like that. But here's our elements panel. In the top left here, we can use this button to find an element. Again, hopefully you're sort of familiar with this. And we can now just take a look at this element. So it's a select element. So let's see if we can find the select element using get elements by tag name. So select, actually let's be a bit more descriptive, number of paragraphs, select num paragraphs, select. Also have Daniel Hodan joined? No. That's not what I wanted. Okay, num-paragraph select. So document is the DOM. It's kind of all of these objects and functions that are related to displaying that HTML page. we can call get elements by tag name, and we want all of the selects in the page. So console log num paragraphs select. Let's see what that gives us. In our console, we can see we have an HTML collection, and there are 5 elements in this collection. It is pretty similar to an array. I think 2 weeks ago when we talked about arrays and objects, I said that an array is actually just an object. It's not really anything particularly special, and I think I possibly demonstrated how you can make an object that has a key of 0 and a key of 1 and a value of something and a value, and then a key of length and a value of the number of those things. That's actually all this is. There's other things that are useful, but actually it is an object just with these keys. We have a key of 0, key of 1, 2, 3, 4, and then a length of 5. So here is even more of a slightly weird hybrid between array and an object. But to us right now, we can just pretend it's an array. So it's not quite what we wanted, because we just wanted one of them. In fact, we wanted this one. So we could just say 2. So it's an array. Actually, it's an object, but it works either way. Here we now just have that element. So num paragraphs select 2. We could do that. That's not great practice at all. So as soon as you're kind of hard coding, you're just assuming the order of anything. That is a reason to change something. Let's see if I can demonstrate why. There's a lot of JavaScript in here that I don't think we really want. So I'm going to see what happens if we get rid of this. This as well. This as well. Okay, that looks fine. It's still working. Script link ID. I don't know what that is. Okay, so it's still all working. Now let's find our select language, select other, select ID num select. I think that's the one we wanted. So num select text, yep. But now if we take this and we decide we actually want this to be like nearer the top of the page. So let's move this up here. It's probably going to look positively awful, but never mind. Okay, so now the product owner has said actually we want this in a different place, and you've got to just shift some stuff around. Now, because we have said, okay, the select tag to choose the number of paragraphs is the second, the third, but with the index 2, the second element with the tag select. But it isn't. It's now the 0th element with the tag select. 0, 1, 2. We now get this one. So you don't want to do that as much as possible. You don't want to do that. Hi, Daniel. So instead, we can use the ID. Luckily, I'll also move that back to a slightly more sensible position. There we go. We should use the ID. So we just want one of them. Therefore, we want to use get element singular by ID. If we look in our DevTools in the Elements panel, so there's a few ways you can kind of figure this out. If you click on it, we can see that the ID here is set to num select, but also when we hover over it, we can see it has select in purple and then hash num select dot text. So that means it is a select element with an ID. The hash is denoting an ID. This is from using the same sort of syntax as CSS. So the hash is denoting the ID, and dot text is denoting that there is a class of text on there. So if we want to get the element by ID, we just pass it num select. So num select is the ID of that element. And now, regardless of wherever it is in the page, we have access to that element. Maybe we do want all the selects, document.getElements by tag name, select, let's all the selects, and now we have, didn't we just have 5? Maybe when I removed the JavaScript, maybe some of the JavaScript was actually dynamically creating another select somewhere in the page, and then mine was running, and therefore it was picking up 5. I mean, we can do that. We will do that in a bit, but that's slightly odd. So we've got all of those select tags, and now finally all the texts. So that select class, that select element had a class of text. We can use getElements by class name to get an array or something like an array of all of the elements with the class text. So let's see how many there are. Actually, there's only 2. We have this select tag and then this input tag. Slightly weird, but never mind. Okay, so we're using all 3 of those getElement by IDs to find our elements in the page. Next, I think we're going to talk about. Next I think we're going to talk about query selector. We're still just going to talk about finding elements in the page. So these sort of 3 separate parts of this process: finding elements in a page, or creating new elements, and updating those elements. So you're updating elements that you're finding in the page or that you're creating from scratch. And we're going to cover all 3 of those. So for now, there's not too much going on here, but we've covered the bases of these get element functions. Next, I think we're going to talk about query selector, and I think query selector, creating elements. Any questions on finding elements? Yeah. So question time will be after this query selector section. Okay, so a lot of the time you will be writing HTML, CSS and JavaScript all in one, and when you're writing your CSS rules, you're writing sometimes relatively complex sort of identifiers to find particular elements and apply the styles to the elements that match these rules. So the browser makers added query selector. So query selector takes a CSS query because you're already familiar with it, because you're building CSS style sheets, they just thought, well, why not use that same complex and powerful query structure and apply that to a function that finds elements in our page. So query selector and query selector all, they both take a CSS query, and query selector gives one. It gives us one element, and then query selector all returns all of the matching elements in that page. So query selector, because it only returns one, it returns the first matching one. So you have your HTML, you have your DOM, your document, and it's all kind of line by line. Even if things are being dynamically created using JavaScript, you still see that it gets updated in the elements panel, and you have this sort of line by line representation. And query selector is always going to go down those lines and find the first element that matches your CSS query. So we want to find the first button in the page. So document.querySelector and the string button. Just like a CSS rule, if we want to apply a style to all of the buttons, we just use the tag button. No punctuation or anything. If we just want the first button in the page, then we just use the tag name. Now we want the cancel button. So maybe the first button is an OK button or something, but now we want the first cancel button in the page. So we can pass it button with the class cancel. So button tag dot cancel, which is a class. So button dot cancel means the first button in the page that has the class cancel. Same thing with nested elements or sort of child elements. If we want the first cancel button in a form, in the first form in fact, then we can pass this CSS query. We find the first form element, and then inside that form element we find the first button element with the class cancel. Obviously these can get incredibly complicated. It's always good to try to keep them as simple as possible, but sometimes you will need to have quite complex CSS queries. But this is why these were invented, to use CSS queries, because you need to kind of learn that syntax for your CSS application. So you might as well use the same syntax that you've already learned for query selector. So here, if we want all of the buttons, we pass it a string with the tag button. And here, if we want all of the elements, again, just like in CSS, we can use wildcards. So query selector all, just match anything, like any element that is any tag. That's what that means. Okay. Now let's try it out. So we want query num paragraphs select. So we're going to get the same elements from all of these, but this time using the equivalent query selector functions. So for that first one, document.querySelector, we pass it an ID of num select. So when we are specifying that it is using an ID, we don't have to include the hash, but with query selector, we do. We need to say, find the element with this ID rather than without the hash, it would try to find an element with the tag num select, which would not be possible, or it probably wouldn't be possible. If we want all the selects, query all the selects, document dot query selector all, just select. So this time, without any punctuation, we want all of the select tags. Just like CSS, we don't use any punctuation. Now query all the texts. So all the elements with the class name text. So just like ID, we pass it a string with a dot preceding the class to specify that we want all the elements that contain that class. So console log query all the selects, query num paragraph select, and query all the texts. Okay, so these three are our get element functions. So num select, that is the correct one that we were looking for. Let's see if it's found the right one using query selector, and it has. So it's the exact same thing. We have a reference to that element by using get element by ID and also by using query selector. This one, which was get elements by tag name, we've got the 4 select tags in an HTML collection. This one with query selector all gives us the 4 elements, the 4 select tags, but it gives it to us in a node list. Now, again, it is basically an array, but to be honest, I don't quite know why it doesn't give them to you just in an array. There are some other kind of properties on a node list that we can use, but an HTML collection actually kind of has more properties, so I don't understand why we get a node list and not an HTML collection, and even then not just a plain old array of elements. I've never understood it. I've always found it slightly bizarre, and I think, I don't know, soon I'll kind of demonstrate an annoying, one of the reasons why I find it annoying, but maybe in a couple of weeks, I think. And again, where previously we had an HTML collection, this time we have a node list, but we do have the correct elements. We have the select and the text field, and the select and the text field. So we're using query selector all to find those elements. Now let's do a slightly more complicated one. So here we've got class JS. Interesting. So one other thing that you can now use now that you're using the browser is the browser's console. So not only is this for printing stuff out, you can actually type in here and run JavaScript commands just like you would in this file. So we have the document. We can call query selector, and let's call query selector JS. So we want the first element with the class JS. Okay, so that gives us the Chinese language choice. I'm assuming that's what's going on. but we wanted the Russian one. So we could do RU, I suppose, but that's a little bit too specific. Maybe we don't necessarily want the Russian one, but we want the third one. What we could do here is nth of type 3, possibly, or 2. I might be getting that wrong. Nth of type P, nth of type N, JS, nth of type 2. Why doesn't that work then? Nth of type query selector. There is no pure CSS equivalent. Well, that's a lie. Nth child. Nth child. Huh. What am I doing wrong? Okay. So that would work. Table TD nth type 2. Okay, anyway, you can do slightly more complicated ones. So let's do, where are we? We've got this one, which is actually, aha, I see. Okay, so it was working, but the HTML is slightly bizarre. Right, so we want the A tag in here, but it's actually the parent, the li, that is the third child. So this A tag, which is what we were actually targeting with query selector JS, is the only child in here. So we're gonna go for li nth child 2 JS, and so actually nth child 3. So we want to select the element with the class name JS that is inside the first li that is the third child of its parent. We can go one step further and say specifically inside nav lang, nav lng, that's the ID of this parent. So inside this element, look for the third li and then get the element with the class JS inside there. That's a bit unnecessary. We could just use A because there's only one element in there, and it's just going to be that one. But this is a slightly more complex query. Third LIA is that. So the console, it takes a little bit of time to kind of get used to using it, but I really encourage you to use it. Once you get comfortable with this, as soon as you need to find anything in the page or kind of do anything or whatever, you'll come to the console first to just quickly try it out before you actually put it in your code. That way you don't have to put it in your code, save it, go back to the browser, refresh, see what happened, oh, you've made a mistake. That seems like a small thing, but do that 100 times and that time adds up. Okay, how about images? So that image, let's try to find it. So document, query selector, image. Let's see what that gives us. It doesn't give us this image, it gives us one all the way up here. Unsquiggled lipsum.com. It gives us this advert, I think. And we don't want that, we want this one. So we could use query selector all and to, but like I said earlier, you don't want to kind of hard code any positions like that. Now, it's a bit odd, so what could we use here? There's no ID, there's no class, but we can use any other of these attributes. It's a slightly weird way to do it, but I suppose we could use the title here. Let's try it out. So image with the title of layout based on lorem ipsum, and we just want the first one. So there we get that image element. So inside the square brackets here, this is CSS syntax. Maybe you haven't discovered this yet, but CSS syntax to choose a particular element with a particular attribute. We use square brackets with the name of the attribute and then an equal sign with the value of the attribute. It's a bit like a key value pair on an object. So yeah, it's a bit of a strange way to find this element, but if it moves around in the page, it's probably still going to be the same image and therefore have the same title. So I think it's probably a reasonably safe bet. Okay, so we've got a bunch of elements in a bunch of different ways ready to do stuff with them. But first, anyone have any questions on finding elements? Nothing? Okay. Next, creating. Aha. When do we get to what? Okay, we get to updating. I'm going to, I'm sure there was a sort of updating elements section, but I suppose it's sort of covered in creating elements. Anyway, I'm now going to update the elements. I think there should be a sort of section on just updating them. So, the DOM stands for Document Object Model. All of these elements are represented in the browser, in the JavaScript, as objects. Now, if we want to change something on an object, we learned a few weeks ago, you can just do object.key equals value. You can set that key on the object to be a new value. And we can do the exact same thing here. So image is that. So I've got my image now. Image dot. And this is where the console becomes really useful. Chrome, this hasn't always existed. It's probably only about 5 years since Chrome has had this functionality, and it's really good. So it's what term that they use? It's like preemptively executing or something like that. So it will figure out all of the things that you can do with an object as soon as you press dot. So in fact, it actually is already giving me a sort of grayed out preview down here as to what would happen if I just hit enter now. So let's say image.alt, that is accessing this attribute. I haven't actually hit enter, but Chrome like preemptively executes this for you to kind of give you a little preview as you're typing, which is super useful. So if I hit enter, I do actually now get that string. But let's go back and look at all the things that we can do. So align, that's just an empty string. Alt, we just saw what that was. Border, empty string. Complete, don't know what that's really referring to. Constructor, cross origin. There's all sorts of things on here. And they aren't just getters. We can set these as well. So if we say image.height, here it's actually specifying the height in the HTML, which is a bit old school. It's not really what you do these days. But if we want to make it taller, we can just set image.height to 300. And now suddenly it's bigger. So this image element is now in our JavaScript just as an object that you are used to using now, and we can get or set any of the properties on this object. So image dot source gives us slightly weird, but it gives us the URL of the image file that is being displayed. Now, this one is a bit weird. It's actually using a base64 encoded image file, and that is you take a binary data, in this case an image, and you convert it to a string. That's pretty much it. So here we're saying the source of this image is actually some data of the type image/xpng, and then following is the data. So like here's the data of the type, and then here is the actual data in the format of base64. So it's just a way of representing sort of numbers and characters and things. And it is one way in my projects at the moment. Facebook, I think it's Facebook, for some reason, I don't really know, but when you kind of post about a game to your Facebook profile, Facebook require that instead of giving them a URL of an image file, you actually give them a base64 encoded string, a representation of an image. So it's fairly common. I don't really think we talk about it on the course, but it's like not common enough to really talk about it, but it's also not very difficult. I always just use a website. I just Google base64 image encode or whatever. Anyway, this is an aside, because normally you would use a URL of an image. So let's go to Google Images, and well, Bing actually gives us like, doesn't it? If we go to Bing Images, doesn't it give us like some nice ones? Here you go. Google Images, boring. I want that one. That one looks nice to me. So I'm going to, it's very big. That is a stupidly big image. Open image in new tab. Okay, no, it's not. Why does it say it's 3,600 by 2,000? Whatever. So if I take this URL, it's also, that's not really an image file, so this may not work. We'll see. If I take that URL, go back to here, so that's us getting the value, getting the source of this image. We can set it to that URL that I just nicked from Bing, and we've now set it to display a different image. So that's it, basically. You don't really do much more than that. Okay, you're going to need to kind of learn the types of things that you can update on different elements, but you have an element in your JavaScript. Maybe you've created that, and we'll find out about that in a bit. Maybe you've found that in the page, but then you just update something about it. And that's how you get interactive pages. There's not too much more to it, really. So that's for an image. That's for updating details of an image. Let's just do this. Image source and image.height is 300. Next, we want to display something different. So here we want this p tag to I don't know, display some other text. Another trick that is really handy, I think people seem not to know about this. I think I'll embarrass him. I think I showed Vasil this about 4 weeks ago, and he didn't know it was possible. So very often you want to just try something out on an element in the page, and you can document query selector that p tag, but if you see here p equals $0, and by hovering over it, it says use $0 in the console to refer to this element. When you have selected an element in the console, it is available to you as a global variable that is called $0. So it's really good. I use this quite a lot, actually. So instead of doing document query selector blah 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 just to try something out in the console, we can click on it, and now we have access to $0. So $0 dot, and we can see here we have different properties available to us because it's an HTML paragraph element, whereas the previous one, I actually think we didn't really look at that. The previous one was an HTML image element. Now these are classes of object. We'll talk about classes, and it's all part of object-oriented programming, which is a whole big subject. We'll talk about that in a few weeks. But they're just different types of objects with different properties available. So $0, we have a line. Again, I think that's an attribute that we can set a line left, right, something like that. The constructor, don't worry about that too much. We'll talk about that when we talk about object-oriented programming. HTML element. So an HTML paragraph element actually is also an HTML element, just a generic one. And so it has all of these, including inner text. That's what I'm after. Inner text gives us the text that appears between the opening and closing tags. So here we get in a professional context, it happens private or corporate apply, blah, blah, blah. So that is getting. We get the text in between these tags. If we want to set it, we just set it to something. So new inner text, we hit enter, and the paragraph now displays new inner text instead of all that stuff about professional contexts. So now we actually want to find that. So field set, the ID of CNT. So paragraph is document.query query selector. So we have CNT, probably standing for content maybe, and then the second of type P. So let's try P nth of type to, let's see if that works, and all of these variables that we're creating, these actually are global variables. So because I'm creating them globally like this, and we'll talk about global stuff again a bit later on, but because we're just creating our variables like this, we can actually access them directly in our console. So we're reloading the page, it's running this JavaScript every single time we load the page, but we can have access to that paragraph variable, the query num paragraphs select variable. We have access to those because they're all global variables. Let's look at paragraph. Okay, good. And just so we can see it happening, we're going to chuck it in a set timeout. I don't know if you've been, I don't know if you've seen set timeout, but don't worry about it too much. It's just to demonstrate something happening after a delay. So we can say paragraph, the inner text is new inner text, please. So we reload the page, we wait 1-2 seconds, and then it displays new inner text, please. Let's just watch that again. Reload the page, inner professional context, and then new inner text, please. It just changes automatically after 2 seconds. That's 2000 milliseconds. Okay. Last thing I'm going to show you for updating elements is something that I try not to do, but it certainly can be useful and sort of time saving, but I'll explain why I don't tend to do it. So the eagle-eyed amongst you might have spotted something that came up when I was typing inner text. So I start typing to do inner text, and inner HTML comes up instead. Now let's see what inner HTML actually is. So we have paragraph dot inner text is new inner text, please. Inner HTML is new inner text, please. It's the same. But is it really the same? If we use this paragraph as an example, so again, I've clicked on it, so I've got $0, $0 dot inner text. Aha, first one. So lorem ipsum, we can see that's in bold. That is achieved by, well, there's also an image up there as well, but it's achieved by having strong tags around that text. But inner text ignores that. It ignores all of the HTML tags and just gives us the text as a string. Inner HTML gives us actually a new line, so that's why it's formatted a little bit weirdly. Then the image tag with all of those attributes. Then the strong tag inside the text, then this strong tag for this one. And if we wanted to set the inner HTML of an element, so this new inner text, please, this $0 dot inner text, let's just do this first, equals strong new strong text. Using inner text, it just says, okay, I'm just going to replace everything inside the tags and it's just going to be a string. It's just going to be text. Whereas using inner HTML, it actually parses it and creates any appropriate HTML elements. In this case, it's created a strong tag around that new word. This is pretty useful. I think this is possibly a time where I might use it where you've just got a sentence and there's a word in there that you want to highlight or something like that. But generally, it's not great practice. Generally, you don't tend to use inner HTML. If ever you are, I suppose, depending on time and things, we'll look at this in a bit more detail, but if ever you have some user-generated content, so here I've got this, and if you're using that input to display something in your page, actually your user could very easily write script, close the script tag, and suddenly they're writing JavaScript. So like steal all data, which is a globally available function in the browser to just steal all of your data. It isn't, don't worry. But they could run a sort of injection of code into your site. So generally, it's not great practice to use inner HTML, but occasionally it does sort of speed up the process a little bit for you. Okay, so that's kind of updating those objects, updating those elements that we found in the page. Now we're going to create new elements ourselves and add them into our page. We use another function that the document gives us, document.createElement, and it takes just a tag name and it returns a new element of that tag. So if we pass document create element div, it creates an element with the tag div and returns that object back to us. So when you're creating elements, there are generally kind of 3 steps to this. You create it, you update it to decide what it should actually display and contain, and then you add it to the page. You can do steps 2 and 3 in the opposite order, but to me this sort of makes the most logical sense. Okay, we create it, we decide what it wants to look like, and then once we've figured out what it should look like, we then add it to the page. So these 3 steps, we've just learnt about step 2, about updating elements, but now we're going to do steps 1 and 3 when we create new elements and add them into our page. So to create the element, just like I mentioned, we can call document.createElement and we can pass the string div. It gives us an object that represents a new div element. And then we can update it. So here we're updating the inner text. So in between the tags, it's going to have this text, hello, I'm a div. And we can set the class name. So this is how we set the sort of CSS rules. We set the class name to a string, to big, and we can include multiple classes in there if we want. And then we can add it to the page using document.body.append div. Now, I'll explain that as I'm kind of demonstrating, but it's really append is the important part. We call append on an element and we pass it an element to append to the parent element. So in this case, body is the parent element. We call append. We pass the new element we want to create in the page. Okay, so let's try that out. We are going to new. What should we create? We'll create a button. Document.create element button. We're going to create that button. We will, for now, just log it out. And we see we have a button element. So let's find it in the page. Reveal in elements panel. That's one way of finding it. So if we do the same thing on this one, reveal in elements panel, the elements panel goes and selects that for us. So for some reason it didn't work. Let's try reveal in elements panel. It's not finding it. Just because we've created an element, it probably, or at this point, it only exists inside the JavaScript. It doesn't actually exist in the DOM just yet. So that's why we have those three steps. We create an element, then we change it somehow, and then we add it to the DOM. So new button, we can set the inner text to click me, and now our button, it kind of looks a bit different in the console, but it's still just a button with all of these properties. Text content is, I can't quite remember the difference between inner text and text content. One of them, I think inner text takes into account the layout and text content doesn't, and I don't quite understand how that works, but anyway. So we have all of these properties on that button object, but it's still not yet in our page. We've created it, we've updated it somehow. Now we need to add it to an existing element. In the example, we used document.body, but now I'm going to use this paragraph. We could add the button to that paragraph. So now we're going to reload. Let's find. Okay, so it's where are we? I think I scrolled right to the bottom. My laptop is not liking something today. Okay, so we've got new inner text, please. That's that p tag. I should reload the page and should see a button inside there. I don't see a button inside there because of these set timeouts. Okay, let's do it in here. So after 2 seconds, it's going to change to new inner text, please, and then after 4 seconds, it's going to add that button. The reason why we couldn't see it was because this bit was running immediately, and then 2 seconds later, we were saying, okay, the new inner text of this paragraph, so everything in between the tags, is going to be set to this string. So the button that was briefly in between the tags, it just gets removed. So now, okay, we waited 2 seconds, we saw new inner text, please, and then we see click me. I'll do it again. Here's the long paragraph, here's the short paragraph, and then here's the button. So we've created a button, we changed something about it, and then we added it to the page. We can say class name is big and red. And then we can apply some styles button, big red, size is, no, what is it? Oh yeah, font size, that should do it. Apparently not. Okay, let's do transform scale. There you go, that'll do. Background red. Looks positively awful, but somewhere there's some kind of CSS. There we go, let's chuck it in there. And we have two different ones. So button big is actually just going to be, or button red, sorry. Button big is just going to be the transform, and button red is going to be the background red. 2 seconds, paragraph changes, 2 seconds later we get our big red button. We could, does anyone, I can't remember what you guys know about set timeout. So set timeout is one function we can use to kind of delay stuff. Do you know the other function that we have available to sort of do stuff with times?
Is there a set interval?
Yeah, perfect. Set interval. So set interval. Who was that, Daniel?
Yeah.
What can you describe what set interval does and how it's different to set timeout?
I believe it. So if we set something to like a 5 second interval, every 5 seconds it would do the action that we said that it should do.
Exactly. The key word there is like every. So set timeout just does it once. It kind of waits for that time period to be up and then runs the function once. But set interval, it will do it every 5 seconds or every 2000 milliseconds or whatever we want. So we can say every 1 second, and actually I've got to do it in here for reasons I'll explain in a minute. Every 1 second, if the new button class name is equal to big red, then let's just set it back to normal big. Otherwise, let's set it to big red. So if it is currently big and red, let's just remove the red. Otherwise, let's add the red. So let's see what that does. 2 seconds, paragraph changes, 2 seconds later, that appears, and then every 1 second, forever, we can actually tell it to stop. But at the moment, every 1 second, forever, it's going to check what the class of that button is and change the class name every 1 second. So the reason I had to do this set interval inside this function is because new button is actually not a global variable because it's now inside a function. This is not necessarily something that is scheduled for today, but it's kind of interesting anyway. So now new button is not defined. It's actually not available in the global scope. It is a local variable inside this function. Variables are function scoped. Another reason why, even if it was a global variable, this happens after 4 seconds. So if we were to run this, I'm flipping between Windows and Mac at the moment, and it's sort of driving me crazy. If we are to run it now, oh yeah, there's a bunch of errors in the console. Uncaught reference error, new button is not defined. That is partly because it's not a global variable, so it's not accessible, but also because this one runs after 1 second, but the 4 seconds hasn't happened yet. So after the 1 second, the 2 second, the 3 seconds, and probably the 4 seconds, that new button doesn't actually exist yet. So when you're doing stuff with time or even kind of user generated stuff, you do have to think about what you have access to at any given moment. So let's get rid of all those errors. That's not very nice. Okay. So we created a button, we appended it to that paragraph. What time is it? 7:25. Okay, that will sort of do just to cover creating something and getting it on the page, but I'll create a bunch more stuff in a bit. But for now, any questions on creating and updating elements? Any chance we can get this website file? Yeah. So this will be included in the lesson. This is in the lessons 09 DOM manipulation. This is the code that I'm going to upload to the repo, so you'll have access to it. So no questions on creating or updating elements. Or you're all ignoring me and frantically doing your project and hoping that no one will know. Because really no one will know. Although actually it's not really true because the commit times and stuff like that. So, you know, there's no escaping having to do it on time. So last, in your project, you learnt about CRUD. CRUD actions, create, read, update, and destroy. We've so far done create, read, and update for page elements, for document objects. Lastly, we want to do the delete section, and we want to remove elements. Luckily, it's pretty straightforward. We call the function remove on an element, and that's it. So we find an item that we want to delete. We use query selector, so li last child, the last list item in a list, and then remove that item from the list. Done. That's all it is. So let's try that out. So actually we have a list. We have a list somewhere. These, do we have another list item? Let's, if I now want to find all of the list items, query selector, all list, actually all of the lists. Oh, there are quite a lot of lists. So there is that one. Then there's that one. Okay, that could be a good one. No disk. What's that? Reveal in elements. Can I do scroll? Oh, scroll into view. Oh, lovely. Yeah, okay, that could be okay. Oh, that's a good one. Oh, WordPress. Who'd have thought I would actually be pleased to see something about WordPress? Okay, so we're going to use that one. So query selector, UL. Oh, it's an ordered. That's an ordered list. Oh goodness me, this is complicated. So a UL that's in an LI, that'll do. So that's the first one. And then LI child of type or nth child 2. Great, that actually worked. Okay. So we're going to find our list. So we now have that list element. Now, another thing we can do with, actually, so, well, I suppose first I'll just demonstrate removing, but what I want to do, so we've got that $0. $0 is that element, $0.remove, done. And $0 actually appears to be kind of selecting the next available one, so I can just keep calling $0remove because $0 is now referring to a different element. It's all sorts of different elements that end up getting deleted. So what I want to do now is, oh no, actually. Oh yeah, we can use set timeout. So on Thursday, I think you learn about events, and that is adding interactivity. So when a user clicks on something, run some code. And so I was going to do that, but actually we won't because that will save that for Thursday. But we can do it with set interval or set timeout or something. So I want to kind of automatically remove all of the list items inside this list. So here we're also going to do it a bit. We're going to do it a bit better. This is bad code. This is all. It's clearly bad code. It's kind of not very readable. It doesn't even do anything. We're going to start writing slightly better code. We're going to write a function. Remove all list items. So from a list and remove. Slowly remove all list items from a list with a delay. So we're going to call slowly remove all list items from that list with a delay of, let's do 1,000 milliseconds. So first, let's just make sure we're calling that correctly. This is something you really should be doing all the time. As soon as you define a function, as soon as you call it, just log out what the values are that you're getting. Maybe you've done it the wrong way around where you're calling. Just something as simple as that can honestly lose you hours. So log out, and in fact you'll end up with lots of logs. So slowly remove all list items, have that in a string as the first argument you pass to console log, and then the next arguments can be the argument that this function receives. It's really, really good practice. So we can now see slowly remove all list items is receiving a list element, an unordered list element, and a delay of 1,000. So now there's sort of a couple of ways we can do this. We want all of the list items inside this list. List is an HTML element. It's a list element. We actually talk about the sort of hierarchy in terms of a kind of family tree. What am I saying? List items. So we can we've got list dot children, gives us an HTML collection, basically an array of all of the child elements. So especially with a list, it's pretty likely that it's going to be an array of list items. But another thing we can do is call query selector on an element. So we can call query selector all, pass it the CSS query li. Now, where document query selector all gives us all the list items in the page, list.query selector all gives us all of the list items inside that one element. So that's probably how I would do it, because perhaps there's buttons, perhaps there's images inside this list, and we don't want to remove those, we just want to remove the list items. So now we want to iterate over all of these list items with a delay, and we want to remove them. Let's get to the delay in a bit, but we have our for loop, or a for in loop, or a for of loop. So has own property key, which one do we want to use? For of. Iterator of object, so we have list item of list items. So for each list item of our list items kind of array type thing. Again, let's log out that we've done that correctly. I rarely use for of and for in, so I get them mixed up. Yes, but I guessed correctly. So we are accessing all of those individual list items in our list element. So now we can call list item dot remove. So for each list item in our array of list items, remove that list item. So if I suppose performance, you can kind of throttle it. Let's see if it takes a bit longer. I don't think it will. Yeah, it takes slightly longer. So you can see that it is there briefly, but it's pretty quick, because it loads up the JavaScript and it runs this immediately. It calls this function immediately. It iterates immediately, and it calls remove on all of these immediately. Now we want to add the delay. So set timeout with a delay, and here is where we call list item dot remove. So inside the set timeout, we're going to wait for however long this delay is, and then remove the list items. So we load the page, it waits 1 second, and then they all disappear. So WordPress, and then there's no WordPress. But that's not quite the functionality that I wanted. I wanted it to remove one by one, remove each list item one at a time. Therefore, we'll want to use a traditional for loop rather than a for of. We could do it using index of possibly, but that is one reason why let's try list query selector all. Okay, list, right, there's nothing in there, so let's do this W5L1, so $0 dot children. Here we get an HTML collection. So index of anything. Index of is not a function. So where we learnt about index of in arrays, this HTML collection is quite like an array, but it doesn't actually have all of the things that arrays have. So that's why I find it really annoying, because why not just give me an array and I know what I can do with arrays, whereas here I sort of know what I can sort of do with this, but I can't do this, so it's not really an array. And the same thing with node list. There's some things that are available, but not others. And yeah, index of is not one of them. It's annoying. Therefore, we need to use traditional for loops. So let I equal 0, I less than list items dot length, I plus plus, and now we have a number. So console log I will log out 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, blah, blah, blah. Why aren't they disappearing? What have I done wrong? List item is not defined. Aha. So list item is list items I. So remember, I think I talked about this a couple of weeks ago. List items is an array. It is our pluralized name. Then in our for loop, where we have our index, each index of each item, we then want to access the item in the array. And so we give it a name that makes sense. It's the singular of the pluralized array name. So we log out and they do disappear. And so we can use this to multiply the delay. So I times delay, we're actually going to fire this off 10 times immediately, but we're going to say, okay, you in actually 0 seconds, in 0 seconds, remove yourself. In then the next one, in 1 second, remove yourself. In 2 seconds, remove yourself, and so on. So we see here all the times we're going to wait, and you can see it is slowly working through each of those list items and deleting them. The delay's a bit long. Let's do 100, and you can see it's not the nicest animation in the world. It's not really an animation, but it's kind of collapsing and disappearing from view. It's slightly more interesting than just disappearing completely. Okay, 20 more minutes. What do we have left on here? I think that's it. So, does anyone have any questions on the DOM in general, or anything else so far on the course? Any particular exercises that have been a struggle, or anything on the project? Ideally, we'd kind of keep it to DOM manipulation stuff, but people don't always have questions about the lesson content, and there might be questions about if you're all stuck on iterations and stuff, then actually I've realised that what were Vasile's lessons on last week? Were they on what were they on? Okay, they were on functions, or one of them was on functions, and that included callbacks, I think. Is that correct? Advanced functions. Yeah. Okay, so you've been exposed to for each and map and filter and all of that. I'm sure it's all still confusing, but arrow functions as well. Oh, amazing! I'd forgotten that.
I think the most difficult part was when you built your own for each map,
Yeah,
filter, and all those.
yeah, that is a very difficult exercise. But honestly, it's like it's such a good one. You use map and filter and for each a bit less, but you use map and filter so regularly that you're really going to benefit from building your own version of that. Honestly, I know it's difficult, but it's such a good exercise.
It was worth it. I just asked you a question like for the 4 off and 4 in. I think I did try it when I was probably doing one of those exercises to get the index. Is that not possible to get the index for the 4 off and 4 in?
Yeah, it is. It's just here because this is not an array. It's not possible. So let's create another file. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's going to be confusing, isn't it? Because okay, so something else. Then for string of array. So console log each string. Okay, we're logging out each string, and then because we can access index of, which is a function on the array that I told you about a few weeks ago, we call the function index of on the array and pass it an element in the array to end up with the particular index of that element inside the array. So
that same goes for the foreign as well.
Yes. So for in, where a for of gives you values, a for in gives you indexes. So, or gives you keys, sorry, and on an array, it's already indexes. So you kind of already have it, but type of string. Are they strings? Yes, they are strings. So it's a bit weird. You should use numbers, but then string. Does it work? Okay, yeah, it does. So arrays obviously allow you to use either numbers or strings as the key accesses. So actually, yeah, for in already gives you the indexes. For of gives you the values, and you can use index of to get the index of those values.
I see, cool.
Okay, that's your question. So what else can we do here? We can so we can have slowly remove all list items. We can refactor this to use for each, but let's do slowly remove all list items. List. We don't want that list. We want all the lists. So document dot query select all UL or OL. Is that going to work? All the lists UL and OL. Yeah, excellent. That works. So all the lists we can actually call for each. So yes, it's not an array, therefore we can't use map, which is super annoying, but for some reason on a node list they actually give you for each. So here we're going to use for each list. Now we're going to call slowly remove all list items on all of the lists. So for each list in the page, call slowly remove all list items. So I'm going to reload the page, and is anything happening, or am I just not seeing any lists? Okay, yeah, I think something happened. Reload the page. Down here. Where's the WordPress thing then? Oh, what have I done? I'm not passing the delay, so let's give it a delay of 100. That's why. So there you go. I did see this undefined. I did see this nan, which means not a number, but I just thought that's probably fine. And it kind of is, like, it's still working. It's still removing the list items from the page, but there's no delay. So if we add a 100-second delay, they kind of all eventually disappear. And then the second argument that we receive in for each is the index on this array, the current index on this list. So here we can set a timeout, and here we can use an arrow function because we're cool like that. And here, so every list in the page is going to start removing the list items 2 seconds after each other. So now it's slightly hard to see what's going on, but and also my computer's going super slow. So yeah, down here I think something's happening. This is probably a list. Yeah, okay, finally. And now that one. And now that one. Is that all of them? Yeah, that looks like that's all of them. So we use our for each function on our node list. It receives each list in our array of lists. It also receives the index of that list. We use that to delay when the list starts dismantling itself, and then we call slowly remove all list items, passing in that particular list with the delay of 100. What else can we do? Okay, there's one other thing that is fairly important. So let's get rid of all the console logs. Okay, we want to find this element, which is limit input, or it's how can we do this? Let's do something slightly weird again with set interval, but $0, because I've clicked on it, is that particular element. $0 dot value gives us whatever text is inside here. So I'm a user, I'm typing in some stupid words, and I access the current value of that input field. It changes whenever the user changes it, so the value is now something different. If we set the value, it also sets the value of the input field. So let's do something with this. So ID is limit input. Limit input is document.query selector limit input. So set interval every second, we're going to get the value of limit is limit input dot value, and for now we'll just log that out. We'll just see what happens. So it logs out 1,000, then F, then this stuff, then nothing, so there's nothing in there, then 37. Every 1 second, every second it is logging out what the current value is. But maybe we could create a new element that contains the current value. So let's say new p is document.create element p. We're going to want to create a paragraph. New p, we want to update it in a text, is going to be the current value of that field. And then limit input dot parent element. So again, limit input as a child of an element, so we go up to its parent and say append on that parent this new p. Therefore, it's going to appear as a sibling of the limit input element, and every 1 second we're going to create a new one. So there we go. We're getting loads of p tags every 1 second. It's going to be the current value. Maybe we could do something slightly more interesting. Value of input. If value of limit dot length. Have we talked about the modulo operator? I don't think we have. Modulo basically divides by the number and gives you the number of the remainder. No, it doesn't give. Yes, it does. It gives you the remainder if it cannot be divided by that number to give you an integer. So 0 modulo 2 gives us 0. 1 modulo 2 gives us 1. 2 modulo 2, there's no remainder. 2 divides into 2. That gives us 0 again. 3 gives us, and 4 gives us 0. 5 gives us 1. So if we want 0, 1, basically, it's kind of a way of doing if it's an odd number or an even number. So here, if length is an even number, then let's find the last p. So document, let's do limit input dot parent element dot query selector p dot last p dot remove. So it's adding some because I have SEFRG 5. That is an odd number. As soon as I add one more, it actually starts removing some. I add another one. It's adding them. It's pretty weird functionality, but it is slightly more kind of interesting than just your standard demonstration stuff. Don't worry too much about modulo. That I mean, that'll take you hundreds of times to actually remember how that works. I always have to look it up. It's one of those things. But the important thing is about creating elements, updating elements, adding them to the page, and removing them and finding them, reading them. Has someone unmuted for a question, or are you just anxiously ready to say
I
goodbye
have
and leave the call?
kind of a random question, if that is okay. For the VS Code, you often jump a lot between where you're writing the code and the terminal.
Yeah.
So if you don't want to use the mouse, you can jump from the code window to the terminal by the control backtick.
Yeah.
What's the key to go back to the code?
I just click on it, I think.
Yeah, you have to use a mouse, is it?
I'm pretty sure there is a shortcut. I guess. You know what? I think I was doing it the other day. Yeah. And then.
You just
create a new one. So if we do Command P, shortcuts, help sheet, keyboard shortcuts reference. So Command P gives you the control palette, I think it's called. That allows you to find files or go to a line or whatever. If you then type in greater than, you get a bunch of commands that are like sort of settings and things that you can run from VS Code. So just Command P lets you find files, your files in your project. Command P and then greater than allows you to do stuff with all the settings and things. So I just typed in shortcuts, open keyboard shortcuts. Okay, so code or editor. Focus editor. Focus on open editor's view. What? Command K E. No, that would be bad. Command K E. Nope. Focus on open editor's view. Command K. Oh. Command K E. Nope. I hate keyboard shortcuts. I know they really actually make your life way easier, but I hate learning them. Focus, search, edit, input.
It's just because when I stand up, the mouse keep,
Oh, I see. Yeah.
fiddling everywhere, sleeping and all that. So I try to use just a keyboard.
Focus first editor group. Okay, that could do it. So we're focused in there. Command 1. Yeah. Then Command 2 gives you editor groups. That's a new thing. Why do you want editor? Oh, I guess that's when you split right. So split right, you get. Okay, that's referred to as an editor group. That's interesting. So there, I can focus on editor group 1 or editor group 2 by holding Command and pressing 1 or 2 or 3 to create a new one. 4. That's way too many. On Windows, it's probably Control. Yeah, keyboard shortcuts are really good. Like, you should take time to learn them, but I'm sort of too stuck in my ways that I know enough shortcuts to make my life easier, but I certainly know there are more. AJ's gone. I think that's it. Does anyone have any other questions?
If not, then I can ask the last one. If that's okay.
You can ask on Slack. Yes, when I open Slack and there's 89 messages, I know who has sent the majority of them. Okay.
It's definitely not me.
Yeah, sure.
It's just Wesley is more like replies a lot. I don't know if that's how you have structured it or.
Yeah, he's certainly friendlier than I am. He's much more willing to help out when people are stuck. I think you need to struggle a bit.
Yeah.
But I think he's much more attentive on Slack. He checks Slack much more often.
We can tag you with a question and you can come and see.
Yeah,
Okay.
you can tag me. If you tag both of us, you'll probably get an answer from Vasil much quicker. But yeah, you can tag me.
Yeah, that you can tag me sounds so enthusiastic.
Yeah, could you tell? Yeah, it's good to struggle. Okay, that's it. Thanks everyone.
Cool. Thank you.